Chapter 22 of the Hand of Fu Manchu. This recording is in the public domain. The Hand of Fu Manchu by Sax Rohmer. Chapter 22. The Secret of the Wharf. I sat in the evil-smelling little room with its low, blackened ceiling, and strove to avoid making the slightest noise, but the crazy boards creaked beneath me with every movement. The moon hung low in an almost cloudless sky, for, following the spell of damp and foggy weather, a fall in temperature had taken place, and there was a frosty snap in the air tonight. Through the open window the moonlight poured in and spilled its pure luminance upon the filthy floor, but I kept religiously within the shadows, so posted, however, that I could command an uninterrupted view of the street from the point where it crossed the creek to that where it terminated at the gates of the deserted wharf. Above and below me the crazy building formerly known as the Joy Shop, and once the nightly resort of the Asiatic riff-raff from the docks, was silent, save for the squealing and scuffling of the rats. The melancholy lapping of the water frequently reached my ears, and a more or less continuous din from the wharves and workshops upon the further bank of the Thames, but in the narrow, dingy streets immediately surrounding the house, quietude reigned, and no solitary footstep disturbed it. Once, looking down in the direction of the bridge, I gave a great start, for a black patch of shadow moved swiftly across the path and merged into the other shadows bordering a high wall. My heart leapt momentarily, then in another instant the explanation of the mystery became apparent, in the presence of a gaunt and prowling cat. Bestowing a suspicious glance upward in my direction, the animal slunk away toward the path bordering the cutting. By a devious route amid ghostly gasometers I had crept to my post in the early dusk, before the moon was risen, and already I was heartily weary of my passive part in the affair of the night. I had never before appreciated the multitudinous sounds, all of them weird and many of them horrible, which are within the compass of those great black rats who find their way to England with cargoes from Russia and elsewhere. From the rafters above my head, from the wall recesses about me, from the floor beneath my feet, proceeded a continuous and nerve-shattering concert, an unholy symphony which seemingly accompanied the eternal dance of the rats. Sometimes a faint splash from below would tell of one of the revellers taking the water, but save for the more distant throbbing of riverside industry, and rarer note of shipping, the mad discords of this rat saturnalia alone claimed the ear. The hour was nigh now, when matters should begin to develop. I followed the chimes from the clock of some church near by, I have never learnt its name, and was conscious of a thrill of excitement when they warned me that the hour was actually arrived. A strange figure appeared noiselessly from I knew not where, and stood fully within view upon the bridge crossing the cutting, peering to right and left, in an attitude of listening. It was the figure of a bedraggled old woman, grey-haired, and carrying a large bundle tied up in what appeared to be a red shawl. Of her face I could see little, since it was shaded by the brim of her black bonnet, but she rested her bundle upon the low wall of the bridge, and to my intense surprise sat down upon it. She evidently intended to remain there. I drew back further into the darkness, for the presence of this singular old woman in such a place, and at that hour, could not well be accidental. I was convinced that the first actor in the drama had already taken the stage. Whether I was mistaken or not must shortly appear. Crisp footsteps sounded upon the roadway, distantly and from my left. Nearer they approached, and nearer. I saw the old woman, in the shadow of the wall, glance once rapidly in the direction of the approaching pedestrian. For some occult reason the chorus of the rats was stilled. Only that firm and regular tread broke the intimate silence of the dreary spot. Now the pedestrian came within my range of sight. It was Nayland Smith! He wore a long tweed overcoat with which I was familiar, and a soft felt hat, the brim pulled down all around in a fashion characteristic of him, and probably acquired during the years spent beneath the merciless sun of Burma. He carried a heavy walking cane, which I knew to be a formidable weapon that he could wield to good effect. But despite the stillness about me, a stillness which had reigned uninterruptedly, save for the danse macabre of the rats, since the coming of dusk, some voice within, ignoring these physical evidences of solitude, spoke urgently of lurking assassins, of murderous Easterns armed with those curved knives which sometimes flashed before my eyes in dreams, of a deathly menace which hid in the shadows about me, in the many shadows cloaking the holes and corners of the ramshackle building, draping arches, crannies and portals to which the moonlight could not penetrate. He was abreast of the Joy Shop now, and in sight of the ominous old witch huddled upon the bridge. He pulled up suddenly and stood looking at her. Coincident with his doing so, she began to moan and sway her body to right and left as if in pain. Then, "Kind gentleman," she whined in a sing-song voice, "thank God you came this way to help a poor old woman." "What is the matter?" said Smith tersely, approaching her. I clenched my fist. I could have cried out, I was indeed hard put to it to refrain from crying out, from warning him, but his injunctions had been explicit, and I restrained myself by great effort, preserving silence and crouching there at the window, but with every muscle tensed, and a desire for action strong upon me. "I tripped up on a rough stone, sir," whined the old creature, "and here I've been sitting waiting for a policeman or someone to help me for more than an hour, I have." Smith stood looking down at her, his arms behind him, and in one gloved hand swinging the cane. "Where do you live, then?" he asked. "Not 100 steps from here, kind gentleman," she replied in the monotonous voice, "but I can't move my left foot. It's only just through the gates yonder." "What?" snapped Smith. "On the wharf?" "They let me have a room in the old building until it's let," she explained. "Be helping a poor old woman, and God bless you." "Come along, then." Stooping, Smith placed his arm around her shoulders and assisted her to her feet. She groaned as if in great pain, but gripped her red bundle and, leaning heavily upon the supporting arm, hobbled off across the bridge in the direction of the wharf gates at the end of the lane. Now at last a little action became possible, and having seen my friend push open one of the gates and assist the old woman to enter, I crept rapidly across the crazy floor, found the doorway, and with little noise, for I wore rubber-soled shoes, stole down the stairs into what had formerly been the reception room of the Joy Shop, the malodorous sanctum of the old Chinaman, John Ki. Utter darkness prevailed there, but momentarily flicking the light of a pocket lamp upon the floor before me, I discovered the further steps that were to be negotiated, and descended into the square yard which gave access to the path skirting the creek. The moonlight drew a sharp line of shadow along the wall of the house above me, but the yard itself was a well of darkness. I stumbled under the rotting brick archway and stepped gingerly upon the muddy path that I must follow. One hand pressed to the damp wall, I worked my way cautiously along, for a false step had precipitated me into the foul water of the creek. In this fashion, and still enveloped by dense shadows, I reached the angle of the building. Then, at risk of being perceived, for the wharf and the river both were bathed in moonlight, I peered along to the left. Out onto the paved pathway communicating with the wharf came Smith, shepherding his tottering charge. I was too far away to hear any conversation that might take place between the two, but unless Smith gave the prearranged signal I must approach no closer. Thus, as one sees a drama upon the screen, I saw what now occurred with dramatic lightning swiftness. Releasing Smith's arm, the old woman suddenly stepped back, at the instant that another figure, a repellent figure which approached, stooping, apish, with a sort of loping gait, crossed from some spot invisible to me, and sprang like a wild animal upon Smith's back. It was a Chinaman, wearing a short loose garment of the smock pattern, and having his head bare, so that I could see his pigtail coiled upon his yellow crown. That he carried a cord I perceived in the instant of his spring, and that he had whipped it about Smith's throat with unerring dexterity was evidenced by the one short strangled cry that came from my friend's lips. Then Smith was down, prone upon the crazy planking, with the ape-like figure of the Chinaman perched between his shoulders, bending forward, the wicked yellow fingers at work, tightening, tightening, tightening the strangling cord. Uttering a loud cry of horror, I went racing along the gangway which projected actually over the moving Thames waters, and gained the wharf. But, swift as I had been, another had been swifter. A tall figure, despite the brilliant moon I doubted the evidence of my sight, wearing a tweed overcoat and a soft felt hat with the brim turned down, sprang up from nowhere as it seemed, swooped upon the horrible figure squatting, simian-esque, between Smith's shoulder blades, and grasped him by the neck. I pulled up shortly, one foot set upon the wharf. The newcomer was the double of Nayland Smith! Seemingly exerting no effort whatever, he lifted the strangler in that remorseless grasp, so that the Chinaman's hands, after one quick convulsive upward movement, hung limply beside him like the paws of a rat in the grip of a terrier. "You damned murderous swine!" I heard in a repressed, savage undertone. "The knife failed, so now the cord has an innings. Go after your pal." Releasing one hand from the neck of the limp figure, the speaker grasped the Chinaman by his loose smock like garment, swung him back once, a mighty swing, and hurled him far out into the river as one might hurl a sack of rubbish. CHAPTER 23